Sundari Johansson Hurwitz. I'm a scholar of South Asian philosophy and religion, and today we're going to talk about Yantra as representation. So this is the second video in a series of 4, and if you haven't yet watched the first video, I encourage you to go and watch that one first, because we're going to do some exercises at the end of this one that build on what we did in that last video. Yantras as representation. So one of the most common things that a yantra represents is a deity or devta. Now, ontologically, deity is understood in 3 basic forms. And these are important to understand if we're going to talk about yantra as representing deity. So the most visible and obvious form of deity is the murti, which is a statue or an image. This is a painting. It could be considered a murti. It's the embodied form of the devata. And these are everywhere. When we think of Durga, when we think of Rajrajeshwari or Tripura Sundari, when we think of Kali, when we think of Shiva, we generally think of them in their embodied form. But this is actually sort of the least true form of the deity. These are forms that are developed to help people connect with them, to develop a relationship that's devotional and feels real. These forms are a way of giving our minds a way to connect with the deity in a way that we understand from our human experience. So we can relate to them as a mother or a father or, a sister, a child. And so this is a very important component for the devotional practices in Hinduism and in Hindu Tantrism, because Tantra does have a very strong devotional component. So that's the gross form. The most subtle and perhaps the truest form of the devata is the causal form, what we call the causal form, which is represented by mantra. It's the root cause of everything that exists is the mantra, right? And so the mantra that represents a particular deity is generally called is generally a bija mantra, and bija means seed. So a bija mantra is a seed syllable. It's usually just one syllable, and a deity may have several syllables strung together to worship them, but usually most commonly it's just a single syllable, and this syllable can be used in lots of different ways. It's drawn onto yantras. It is spoken aloud sometimes. Most often it's repeated internally and not externally, especially by very traditional tantric practitioners. Many tantric practitioners don't think that bija mantras should be said aloud. Many of them believe that the only time that the bija should be said aloud is when a guru is giving shaktipat or is initiating a disciple or shishya, a student, and that when it's spoken aloud, that it's a very powerful act, and so generally speaking, there is a strong prohibition in some communities against speaking it out loud, because it's so sacred and so powerful, and it's to be kept secret. And these are sort of open secrets, but in some traditions, they really want to keep a sense of secrecy to protect the information in the tradition, and to limit who can practice in that tradition. So this mantra is internalized. It may be externalized, but most typically the goal is to internalize the mantra, to make it an automatic process of repetition. And through that process, the practitioner recognizes their identity as being not separate from infinite being. And so what that really means is this is not really the ego, the conscious ego, sort of saying, oh yes, I'm one with everything. It's not like that. It's a non-intellectual, sudden persistent realization, understanding that goes beyond the conscious mind. Now, somewhere in between the causal form, which is the mantra, and the gross form, which is the murti, is the subtle form, and the subtle form is the yantra. It creates a kind of bridge between the formless mantra and the embodied murti, right? It's a geometric representation of the vibrations of the mantra, of how the deity really looks in terms of its vibration. You may have seen videos of where they take a plate and they put some sand on the plate and then put it on a speaker and then play different sounds through the speaker, and it moves the sand into different shapes based on the vibration of the sound. And that's really what the yantra is doing. And this is kind of remarkable because the yantra is a representation of sound. And this was, sort of long before we had speakers and things to do that. So it's kind of a really cool thing to think about, the fact that, sound does actually make mandalas and yantras of a sort. So the yantra is this kind of bridge between the mantra and the embodied form. The yantra's internal geometry represents the manifest vibrations emanating from the mantra as they begin to take shape in the world of form. And a yantra has to be expertly drawn and empowered by an experienced, qualified practitioner in order to have any divine presence or power. So let's talk about visual forms of yantras. Most obvious and most common are the lotus mandalas with diagrams within representing different energies. So for instance, we have the Sri Yantra here. I'm not going to really get into the Sri Yantra, but it's a good example of how sophisticated yantras can be, not just in terms of the physical form, but in terms of the meaning behind it and the symbolism. Every single piece of that yantra, every single bit has a complex meaning, a different mantra, a different procedure to worship that piece, a different deity inside of it. And all of it together in its totality represents Tripura Sundari, the great goddess of Sri Vidya. Now, the yantra that I do want to talk about today is the Kali yantra. So the Kali yantra represents the goddess Kali. So this downward pointing triangle is the yoni, and it represents the Devi. So the yoni is usually associated with the vulva when it's translated. But to really understand what the yoni means in the context of a yantra, you have to think a bit bigger, because the yoni is the source of everything. It's the source of all creation. In this sense, the yoni is, if we were to think about it biologically, the yoni is not just the vulva, but the entire sort of female reproductive system, including the womb itself. Kali's yantra, we have 5 concentric triangles. And this is just packed with meaning. And we can't really get into it in depth, but I can talk about it a little bit. So the 5 triangles represent the 5 koshas, which are the 5 sheaths or cells or containers of existence. These 5 triangles have 15 points, and those 15 points represent the 15 Kali Nityas. These are forms of the goddess associated with the 15 phases of the moon, of the waning moon, with the 16th being Mahakali as the dark moon. This tradition is really interesting because it goes back to the 11th century, to the Vamakeshwari Mata. which is a very important tantric text in the early tantric tradition. The original nityas are very closely associated with the waxing moon, and the first 15 are associated with those 15 days of the waxing moon, and with Triprasundari being the full moon. Now, the Nitya cult was an important predecessor of the Srividya tradition. Now, around the 16th and 17th century, a text called the Shakti Sangama Tantra recorded the development of the worship of the Kali Nityas. And this was clearly sort of borrowed from the original Nitya tradition, except for these forms of Kali, these 15 forms, these 15 goddesses or Nityas, Kali Nityas, were associated with the waning moon, with the dark moon being Mahakali herself. The 8 petals in this yantra represent a number of things, such as the 8 chakras. There are many different systems with many different numbers of chakras, and one of the Matsyendranath schools has a system of 8 chakras, and so they can represent the 8 chakras. They also represent the 8 Bhairavas and Bhairavis. These are forms of Shiva and Shakti, like very ferocious forms of Shiva and Shakti. The square is the Bhupura, which we've already talked about previously. And in the very center of the yantra is something very important, and that is the Bindu. So in the very center of the yantra is the Bindu. And this is really the essence of the deity in the yantra. Without a Bindu, the yantra is essentially lifeless. That Bindu is the essence. It represents the power of the Bij mantra. It's the concentrated energy of the deity. It's the infinite point that represents form and non-form, being and non-being. So if we look at the yantra and we begin at the center, we can see that it expands out from the center in vibrations, pulsing outwards. And so in the Kali yantra, we see these 5 pulses into the 5 triangles, and then beyond that, unfolding into the lotus petals in this field of pure existence, which is the Bhupura. So there's a lot going on here. So yantras are constructed in a lot of different ways, and every tradition has its own methods and beliefs and stuff about sort of constructing yantras. Now, one common thing is that the Bindu is often placed last. Once the entire yantra is constructed, even if it's being built from the center outward, once the entire yantra is constructed, then the Bindu is placed, because you want to make sure that your yantra is well constructed. So in this Kali yantra, the Bindu represents Kali herself. This is another form of the Kali yantra. This is from an old Aghori ritual manual that's written in Bengali. The yantra does not have a Bindu in this image because it's not been enlivened. Now, this is the Shama yantra. Shama is a form of Kali, and she is especially associated with the cremation grounds and cremation ground practices. Now, what's interesting about this is that in the center of the 5 triangles, we have 2 interlocking triangles, one pointing up and one pointing down. Now, we already know that the downward pointing triangle is the yoni. The upward pointing triangle is the linga, and it represents Shiva. So these interlocking triangles they represent Shakti and Shiva in sort of divine sexual union. They're interlocked and completely harmonious together. They are creating the universe together. And in images of Shama, we see, just like in other images of Kali, we see Shiva lying under her feet. Now, in some of these images, Kali is not just standing on Shiva. She is, Shiva is lying on top of a corpse on a cremation pyre, and she is sitting on top of him, and they are in sexual union. So when we have these two triangles, the upward pointing triangle representing Shiva and the downward pointing triangle representing Shakti, when we have them together, they represent the sexual union of the god and the goddess of Shiva and Shakti engaged in this act of eternal cosmic creation. This is an amazing Kali Yantra. I love this image. It's so interesting, and it's very literal as well. And we have here a blending of the gross and subtle forms of the goddess, and it's very unusual. This is from Bengal. This is in the British Museum, and it's just an amazing, beautiful image. Here we have, you can see the 5 triangles, which are personified by the 15 Kali Nityas. And in the center, we have Mahakali, or the Great Kali in the center as the 16th Nitya. In the description of this image, the British Museum says that she is sitting on a demonic figure, and that the demonic figure is on top of Shiva. And I don't know about you, but this image to me, that screams Mahakala. If you go to Nepal and you look at images of Mahakala in Nepal, looks very, very similar. It could also be a form of Bhairava. But I think that this is really showing the influence of Nepalese traditions on the Bengali traditions. Around the 12th to 13th century, there was a sort of catastrophic break in the Tantric traditions across North India, like all across from the east to the west, that may have had something to do with that may have had to do with a number of different factors. It could have been the rise of the Mughals. It could have been just that these traditions were petering out. And so some of the traditions split off and went up into Nepal, where they survived, or down into South India, where they survived. And they sort of took very different forms in these places. And to me, this image really says that there was a lot of acknowledgement here of the influence of the Nepal traditions. That is my interpretation. That is not the British Museum's interpretation. You may have your own interpretation if you study these images yourself. I have been, based on my recent research in Bengal and sort of uncovering the connections between Nepal and Bengal and Assam, and lots of cross-pollination happening there. I really think that this artist is telling us with this image that this is Mahakali and Mahakala, and that that Shiva, sort of the more Bangla form of Shiva that's lying underneath Mahakala, is connected to that, and that there is a connection between these traditions. To me, this is sort of a visual evidence of the research I've been doing, the sort of pieces I've been piecing together. So that's very exciting for me. Moving on from these amazing Kali Yantras, I could spend all day talking about Kali Yantras. They're just like really great. But we have limited time. So other forms of yantra are diagrams used for magical purposes. And these may contain deities or not. So for example, the Kurma chakra. So remember earlier we talked about how when the word chakra is used for For yantras, it doesn't necessarily mean round, that it's round. The Kurma chakra, there's, I'm going to just pop a couple different forms up here. That can be used to determine where and when beneficial or harmful events will happen. It can be used to map out a space and figure out like where the beneficial energies, where the bad energies, that kind of thing. The Kurma chakra is not round. It's called a chakra, but it's not round. It's a square. It's actually a series of squares that's sort of more in line with the magic square of that's found in lots of different traditions throughout South Asia, China, the Middle East. In India, we see these from the 11th century in Jain temples. It's very strongly associated with Jain magic. There's also, in Burma and Thailand, these magic squares as tantric magical items are very popular. These are very practical kinds of yantras. These are generally things that you create because you want either to sort of suss out what's going on or because you want to make something happen. So just to wrap things up, the yantra is really ultimately a visual expression and representation of various forms of reality and the means to control it. Yantras are a way of documenting this reality and manipulating this reality and sort of putting into shape what reality really looks like and getting out of the sort of embodied forms into a different way of thinking about reality. Because although the world is real, there's also this whole other layer of existence. And so the yantra is a way of accessing those forms that are formless. It is a form that allows you to access the formless. Yantras are really a way of beginning to tap into the formless when you aren't quite ready to experience that quite yet in a full way. The yantra can help create a pathway into that energy. The very act of creating and empowering a yantra, that places cosmic power into the hands of the practitioner. The Tantra is all about macrocosm and microcosm, and whoever controls the microcosm controls the macrocosm, right? So if your body contains the universe, then your mastery of the body, your mastery of every aspect of the body, including, all of the pleasures, all of the difficulty and pain of very strenuous sadhana. If you can master that, then you can master the universe. If you can control your prana, your breath, then you control the prana of the universe. And this is very powerful. And so creating a yantra and empowering a yantra and manipulating the energies in the yantra is a way of expressing that idea. That's a very powerful thing. And so creating the yantra, empowering the yantra, controlling the energies in the yantra is a way of affirming and expressing that idea of the microcosm controlling the macrocosm. In the next video, we're going to talk about the yantra in the body and how the body is also a yantra. So this is the part of the video where we reflect on what we've learned and we go down those little mental pathways and we, think about deeper questions that we have, any ways that our thinking has been shifted. And I just want you to go and document that. I want you to just, go write down some notes about, like, what did this make you think about? What questions has this brought up for you? Is there anything that you want to research based on all of this? So while you do that, I'm going to say bye for now, and I'm going to take a little break. I guess a virtual break, right? I'm going to actually take a break right now, but we'll also take a little virtual break. So I'll say bye for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.